My sisters and brothers, we sometimes get in the temptation, both with things we're supposed to read and with sacred scripture, of pulling out parts and remembering parts and not remembering everything that was written. And so I'm sure all teachers have had this experience. You can tell whether or not someone's done the assignment. 2 examples. I was teaching third-year graduate students. Graduate school. Papers turned in. It was the spring semester. Fall semester, wrong course. It was an automatic 0. I wouldn't even read it. If you don't know where you're at, I really can't help you. A high school student. The student was supposed to read The Man of La Mancha. And I read the first paragraph of his paper and said, "You didn't read the book, did you?" And very indignantly, he said, "Why did you say that?" I said, "Well, you said that the Knight of the Mirrors is the hero." And he said, "Yeah." I said, "That's how I know you haven't read the book. Because I have. And I know you haven't." We get in this temptation of pulling out these little quotes, and we do it also with sacred scripture. For example, you'll see very frequently this wonderful quote from Jeremiah, where he says, "From the womb I have formed you, and I know the plans I have for you. I have consecrated you a prophet to the nations." That part we like. And you'll see it on posters and mugs and mouse pads. Remember how Jeremiah ends? Jeremiah is blind and being pulled off into exile. That part we kind of skip over. Hermanos y hermanas, tenemos la tentación siempre de recordar y escuchar parte, mas no de la total. Por ejemplo, cuando yo enseñé a la level de la escuela de graduate, después de universidad, un estudiante dame un papel, el curso incorrecto y el semestre incorrecto. No lee. 0 automáticamente. No me interesa. No conoce dónde está, no puedo ayudarlo. Un otro estudiante de escuela secundaria, dame un papel para leer y yo leo el primer párrafo. Tú no lees, ¿de verdad? El estudiante, ¿por qué se dice esto? Porque es el hombre de la mancha, y yo lo soy, el caballero de los espadas, no es el persona de la primera en la historia. Yo lo sé porque yo leo el libro. Es claro, tú no lees. Porque tenemos esa tentación de libre parte, no en total. El mismo que nosotros tenemos el mismo problema cuando nosotros vamos a la Biblia. Por ejemplo, en esta primera parte de Jeremías nosotros escuchamos: el Señor diga, el profeta, desde antes de formarte en el seno materno, te conozco. Desde antes de que nacieras, te consagré como profeta para las naciones. Esta parte nosotros queremos recordar frecuentemente, especialmente en inglés. Puede leerlo en posters o en copas de café o en otro lugar, pero nosotros no recordamos toda la profecía. ¿Recuerda que es el fin de Jeremías? Va seco en exilio. Esa parte nosotros no queremos recordar particularmente. We have the same problem with St. Paul. I'm sure many of you have heard at some point in your lives Paul's discourse on love when he says, love is patient, love is kind, love bears all things, rejoices in all things. Does that sound familiar to anybody? How many of you have heard that at a marriage ceremony at some point in your life? How many of you have heard it at some point in your life where he says, now we see him here and obscurely, but we will come to see face to face. Although now we see him perfectly, God knows us perfectly. And he has left us 3 things: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love. How many of you ever heard that in your life? How many of you heard it at a funeral? Somewhat ironic, isn't it, that the marriage and the funeral readings are the same reading? Do you remember what's going on in Corinth when Paul says that? Do you remember what that part of the letter is about? He's chewing them out. And he's upbraiding them for their behavior in church. See, that's the part we like to forget about. Because that's not quite so comfortable. Nosotros escuchamos esta parte muy famosa de San Pablo cuando él diga a nosotros, el amor es comprensivo, el amor es servicial, no tiene envidia, el amor no es presumido, ni envanece, no es grosero, ni egoísta. Y nosotros escuchamos estas palabras frecuentemente en el servicio del matrimonio, de verdad. Y también parte de la misma lectura, nosotros escuchamos cuando yo era niño, hablaba como niño, siente como niño, y pensaba como niño. El fin de esa parte con ahora tenemos estas tres virtudes, la fe, la esperanza y el amor. Pero el amor es el mayor de las tres. Nosotros recordamos, escuchamos esta frecuentemente en la funeral, en la misa por los muertos. Interesante, ¿no? Que la parte para el matrimonio, la exequias, es el mismo lectura. Manfato, esta parte de la carta de los Corintios, es una castigación contra ellos por sus acciones en la iglesia. Y esa es la parte que nosotros queremos recordar. Nosotros queremos recordar las partes más buenas que nosotros queremos recordar porque es cómodo. No en las partes que es más duro. We hear the same thing in the gospel today. If you remember last week, Jesus says in the synagogue, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim liberty to captives, to announce a year of favor from the Lord. And everyone remembers that. In fact, again, you see it all over the place. But what did he say next? And it must have been a humdinger that had people ready to kill him. They were going to throw him out, not only throw him out of town, but throw him down the hill. Unfortunately, St. Luke doesn't record that, but it must have been really something. But we get a hint of what he said because St. Luke records for us that the people want him to do there in Nazareth what he did in Capernaum. Now, a complete side note. Has nothing to do with the gospel. If you go to Capernaum today, it's his hometown of Jesus. I'm sure Nazareth is happy to know that. San Lucas no recuerde por nosotros cuál es la cosa se dice Jesús que causa este enojado del pueblo contrario de él. Nosotros no escuchamos todas las palabras. Nosotros recordamos de la semana, antes una semana, cuando el Señor se dice, el Espíritu del Señor esté sobre mí, porque ha unido para llevar a los pobres la buena noticia, para anunciar la liberación a los cautivos y la curación a los ciegos, para dar libertad a los oprimidos y proclamar el año de la gracia del Señor. Nosotros tenemos una tendencia de recordar esta parte del Evangelio, una parte cuando es más duro y más difícil. Y nosotros conocemos, ellos quieren Jesús hacer los mismos milagros allá en Nazaret, como él hace en Capernaum. Interesantemente, se va a Capernaum hoy, en el templo moderno, un signo se dice, la ciudad de la casa de Jesús, el hometown. Una sorpresa en Nazaret, yo lo sé. Mas Jesús se diga a ellos, durante los tiempos de Elías, no es un milagro a una persona de hebreo, solamente una persona en Sarepta, en la ciudad de Sidón, una persona extranjera, una persona greca. Y también Eliseo, era un milagro solamente es para Naamán, que es de Siria, parte de la fuerza de ocupación en ese tiempo. Ellos no quieren recordar esas cosas de su historia, que es duro y no bueno. Ellos no quieren recordar las acciones maldades o las acciones que ellos necesitan cambiar porque las palabras de la Santa Escritura y porque ellos quieren refutar el Evangelio y refutar a Jesucristo. When Jesus reminds the people that only 2 people were healed during the time of the famine, one was given food, and it was a widow in Zarephath. We're told she lived in Sidon, so she was a Greek, she was a foreigner. During the time of Elisha, only one person was healed of leprosy, Naaman from Syria, who, by the way, was part of the occupying army. They didn't like hearing that so much. And they refused to hear what he said, and as we know from the gospel, wanted to toss Jesus out of their town and throw him down the hill, and even to put him to death, because they did not like hearing those things that were more difficult and more challenging, and those things that would cause them to have to change the way they were living. That part they wanted no part of. And it's for that reason that we have this season of ordinary time. The whole purpose of ordinary time is for us to go through the majority of the gospel, hearing it in its entirety. Not just the parts we like or find comforting, but those parts that challenge us and make us say, how am I doing this gospel in real life? How am I putting these things I have learned into practice? Not taking out those parts that affirm what we're doing, but the whole of the gospel that makes us look at our lives completely and say, how are we doing all of these things? How are we putting this whole teaching of Jesus into practice? Hermanos y hermanas, tenemos la misma tentación para escuchar parte de los evangelios y parte de esas frases que nosotros queremos porque son amado a nosotros o cómodo o confirmar nuestras acciones. Y nosotros no queremos escuchar otras palabras que se diga a nosotros necesitan cambiar nuestras vidas o convertirnos al evangelio en un modo que no es cómodo. Y por eso nosotros tenemos el tiempo ordinario, y durante el tiempo ordinario nosotros escuchamos el total del evangelio. Nosotros escuchamos lo total de la vida, el ministerio y los enseñamientos de Cristo. Y eso es la causa de esta estación, es por nosotros escuchamos el total del evangelio, el total de la vida de Cristo. No solamente las partes que nosotros queremos escuchar o son cómodos por nuestras vidas, mas también las partes, cual no es cómodo, que llámanos a convertirnos a la vida de Cristo, convertir nuestras acciones en conformidad con el Evangelio y no con otras voces. It is during this time that we call the ordinary time, these 34 weeks that we go through the gospel, bit by bit, looking at how Jesus lives, what Jesus teaches, what it is he does, and it is a call for us to conform our lives to the life of the gospel. Not the things we want, not the things we think God should do, not the things we think Jesus should do, but to instead change our lives to look like his. For all of us, there are different challenges, there are different things that we find easy, different things we find hard, but it's a way for us to look at the whole of Jesus' life and to move closer to living as he did, to move closer to acting as he did. Not always those voices that we want to hear or those voices that tell us we're right, but to ask ourselves, is what we're doing looking like the whole of the gospel? For all of us, there are different things that are hard and there are different things that are easy. But for all of us, it's a challenge to hear the whole gospel, to see the whole of Jesus' ministry, to embrace it in its totality, and to embrace the church's teachings that help us to live out these gospels more fully. It's not always easy. It's not always what we want to do. Just as most of us probably don't want to find out that, like Jeremiah, we're going to be set as a wall of brass against the city we live in. Again, you notice that never shows up on a coffee pot? Ever notice that? but it is the whole of sacred Scripture we are called to. The whole of the gospel we are called to. The whole of our life brought into the gospel so that we too may live, teach, act, pray, and proclaim the whole of who Jesus is.